This is not a story meant to scare you. It's a confession that was never meant to be heard. What you're about to listen to is real, or at least, it was real to the person who lived it. Welcome to True Horror Confessions. If you're brave enough to keep listening, subscribe now. Because once these stories begin, they don't let you go. I need to tell someone what happened, even if no one believes me. Even now, 3 years later, I'm not certain I wasn't the one who got it wrong. I think about Mrs. Bellamy almost every day, and some nights I wake up convinced I should have said something sooner, done something more. But then I remember how ordinary everything seemed, how easy it was to explain away each small thing, and I wonder if I was the monster after all, the neighbor who suspected an innocent woman of something unspeakable. I moved into the Havenwood Apartments in the fall of 2019, right after my divorce was finalized. It was a modest complex in a quiet part of town, the kind of place where people kept to themselves, and that was considered a virtue rather than a failing. 2-story brick buildings arranged in a horseshoe around a central courtyard, about 40 units total. The rent was reasonable, the management was responsive, and nobody bothered you unless you gave them a reason to. My apartment was on the 2nd floor, Unit 212, facing the courtyard. I could see the laundry room from my kitchen window and the small playground that nobody ever seemed to use. The building across the courtyard housed units 101 through 108, and it was in 106 that Mrs. Bellamy lived. I first noticed her about a week after I moved in. I was carrying groceries up the stairs when I saw her standing at her window, perfectly still, watching me. Not waving, not smiling, just watching. She was an older woman, maybe late 60s, with gray hair pulled back tight and a face that might have been handsome once, but had settled into something harder. I nodded at her, the way you do, and she didn't respond, just kept watching until I disappeared into my own building. That first impression didn't alarm me. Some people are shy. Some people are suspicious of new neighbors. I figured she'd warm up eventually, or she wouldn't. And either way, it didn't much matter to me. I was focused on rebuilding my life after the divorce, starting a new job at the accounting firm downtown, learning how to cook for one person instead of two. I had enough on my mind without worrying about unfriendly neighbors. The Havenwood community was mostly working professionals and retirees. My immediate neighbors were a young couple in 210 who worked opposite shifts, and a single mother in 214 named Carla, who had 2 kids under 10. We'd wave in the hallways, make small talk about the weather or the water pressure, but nothing deeper than that. It was comfortable, anonymous in a way that felt safe. I learned about Mrs. Bellamy in fragments, the way you learn anything in an apartment complex. The maintenance man, Jorge, mentioned she'd lived there for almost 15 years. The longest tenured resident in the whole complex, he said, which seemed to impress him. The woman in the leasing office told me Mrs. Bellamy had never once been late on rent, never filed a single complaint, never caused any trouble. A perfect tenant, she called her. I remember thinking that was a strange phrase. Perfect tenant, as if the goal of living somewhere was to be so invisible that management forgot you existed. Those first few weeks, I noticed Mrs. Bellamy watching me several more times, always from her window, always with that same expressionless stillness. I started to feel self-conscious, carrying my groceries, taking out my trash, even just walking across the courtyard to check my mail. I'd glance up at her window, and sometimes she'd be there, sometimes she wouldn't, and I never knew which was worse, seeing her watching or wondering if she was watching, and I just couldn't see. I told myself I was being paranoid. A lonely old woman with nothing better to do than watch the comings and goings of her neighbors. It wasn't sinister. It was sad. I made a mental note to knock on her door sometime, introduce myself properly, maybe bring cookies or something. Be a good neighbor. That's what you do. But I never did. Winter came early that year. By mid-November, the temperature had dropped and stayed there, and the courtyard emptied out as everyone retreated into their heated apartments. I saw less of my neighbors and, for a while, less of Mrs. Bellamy. The holidays passed quietly. I spent Christmas with my sister in Cleveland and came back to find everything exactly as I'd left it, including, I noticed, Mrs. Bellamy's apartment. Her curtains hadn't moved an inch, as far as I could tell. The The same sliver of light was visible through the gap, the same shadow of a lamp against the fabric. I wondered if she'd gone somewhere for the holidays. But then I saw her a few days after New Year's, shuffling across the courtyard toward the dumpsters. She was carrying a single white trash bag, held away from her body like it contained something unpleasant. I was coming out of the laundry room, and we nearly crossed paths. I said, "Hello, Happy New Year," something like that. She looked at me with those flat, colorless eyes, and didn't respond, just kept walking, disposed of her bag, and shuffled back to her apartment without once looking back. It was the first time I'd seen her up close, and something about her face stayed with me afterward. Her skin had a grayish quality, not pale but actually gray, like old newspaper. And her hands, I remember her hands were red and raw looking, the skin cracked around the knuckles. I told myself she probably just had dry skin from the cold. A lot of older people did, nothing unusual about that. But that night, lying in bed, I kept thinking about those hands, about the way she'd held that trash bag away from herself, about the way she hadn't even acknowledged my existence when I spoke directly to her. The smell started sometime in January. At first, I thought it was my garbage disposal acting up again, a faint, sweetish odor that I'd catch for a moment and then lose. I ran the disposal, poured baking soda down the drain, even had Jorge come by to check the pipes. He said everything looked fine, probably just a dead mouse in the walls somewhere. "It'll pass," he said. "They always do." But the smell didn't pass. If anything, it got stronger. Not constantly, it would come and go, sometimes absent for days, and then suddenly overwhelming for an hour or two before fading again. It was worst in the evening, I noticed. Late evening, after dark. That's when it would drift in from somewhere, thick and cloying, with an undertone of something else. Something that made my stomach turn without my being able to identify exactly what it was. I started paying more attention to when the smell appeared. I even made notes in my phone, feeling slightly ridiculous but unable to stop myself. The pattern wasn't entirely consistent, but there was a rough rhythm to it. Every 5 or 6 days, the smell would peak, then it would fade. Then, 5 or 6 days later, it would peak again. Around the same time, I started noticing things about Mrs. Bellamy's apartment that I hadn't before. Little things. The way she took out her trash always late at night, usually between 11 and midnight. The way her windows stayed covered at all hours. Never a curtain pulled back except for that same narrow gap. The way deliveries would appear at her door, grocery delivery, it looked like, and disappear within minutes, as if she was watching for them, ready to grab them the instant they arrived. I told myself I was looking for a mystery where there wasn't one. A lonely old woman with odd habits and poor social skills. That's all. The smell was probably coming from somewhere else entirely. The building's incinerator, which had been malfunctioning for weeks, or the sewage system backing up in the cold. Jorge had mentioned something about that, but then Whiskers disappeared. Carla's cat. A fat orange tabby that used to sun itself on the courtyard benches when the weather was warm. I'd seen it dozens of times, always lounging in the same spots, always looking supremely unbothered by anything. Carla let it roam during the day, which I thought was risky given the traffic on the main road, but it always came back. Always. Until it didn't. Carla knocked on my door one evening in late January, her eyes red, asking if I'd seen Whiskers. She'd been looking everywhere, she said. Put up flyers, asked all the neighbors. Nobody had seen him for 3 days. Her kids were devastated. I told her I was sorry. I'd keep an eye out, but I hadn't seen him either. That night, I watched from my window as Carla walked slowly around the courtyard with a flashlight, calling for Whiskers. She stopped in front of Mrs. Bellamy's building, shining the light into the bushes there, calling and calling. I saw Mrs. Bellamy's curtain move. Just a twitch, barely perceptible, but I saw it. And I thought I saw something else too, a shape behind the curtain, watching Carla the same way she'd watched me. Whiskers never turned up. I told myself, cats run away sometimes, get hit by cars, fall prey to coyotes or foxes. It was sad, but it happened. It didn't mean anything. But I started paying closer attention to the courtyard after that, and I started noticing how many posters for missing pets there were on the community bulletin board. A small dog named Buster, missing since October. A gray cat named Shadow, last seen in December. Another cat, a white one, from the apartment complex 2 blocks over. 4 missing pets in 4 months, all from the same general area. Could be a coincidence. Could be a predator of the animal variety making rounds through the neighborhood. Could be a lot of things. Spring came slowly that year. March was cold and gray, and April wasn't much better. The smell had become something I was almost used to, a background presence that I no longer noticed most days. I'd stopped making notes in my phone. I'd stopped wondering about it. I had work to focus on, and a tentative new relationship with a woman I'd met through a dating app, and the 100 small concerns of daily life that crowd out everything else. But there were still moments. Like the night I came home late from dinner with Sarah, the woman from the app, and saw Mrs. Bellamy in the courtyard. It was after midnight, cold enough that I could see my breath, and she was just standing there. Not walking anywhere, not doing anything, just standing in the middle of the courtyard, her face turned up toward the sky. I froze on the walkway, watching her, and for almost a full minute she didn't move. Then, without looking at me, without acknowledging that anyone else existed, she turned and walked back to her apartment, slowly, shuffling, like someone in a dream. Or the morning I saw the delivery truck, not the usual grocery service, but something else, a refrigerated truck, the kind you see outside restaurants taking meat deliveries. It was parked behind Mrs. Bellamy's building, and a man was unloading something wrapped in black plastic, something heavy from the way he was carrying it. He took it around the side of the building, out of my line of sight, and a few minutes later he drove away. I never saw where the package went. Or the night I woke at 3 a.m. to the sound of running water, not from my apartment, from somewhere below me, somewhere outside. I got up and looked out my window and saw Mrs. Bellamy's lights on, all of them, blazing behind her covered windows. And I could hear, faintly, the sound of water running. Not a faucet, something heavier, like a hose or a drain. These moments accumulated without adding up to anything. Each one, taken alone, was nothing. An eccentric neighbor, odd hours, deliveries I didn't understand. Everyone has neighbors like that. Everyone has moments that feel off without being obviously wrong. But then Sarah asked me about the smell. We'd been dating for about 6 weeks by then, and she was spending the night for the first time. I'd cleaned obsessively, cooked dinner, tried to make everything perfect. And at some point in the evening, she stopped mid-sentence and said, "What is that smell?" I didn't smell anything at first. I'd gotten so used to it that my brain had learned to filter it out. But when I focused, when I really paid attention, I could detect it, that same sweetish undertone with something rotten beneath. "I don't know," I said. "It comes and goes. The building has some issues." Sarah wrinkled her nose. "It smells like, I don't know, like meat that's gone off. Or something worse. The incinerator's been broken," I said, which was true. They're supposed to fix it soon. But Sarah kept sniffing the air, kept frowning, and eventually she went to the window and looked out at the courtyard. "Is it coming from outside?" I joined her at the window. Mrs. Bellamy's apartment was dark, for once. No light behind the curtains, no shadow of movement, just darkness. "Probably," I said. "The dumpsters are back there." Sarah turned away from the window, but I saw something in her expression, a flicker of unease that she was trying to hide. She didn't mention the smell again that night, but she didn't stay over again for a while after that either. The next morning, I decided to do something I'd been avoiding. I went downstairs, crossed the courtyard, and knocked on Mrs. Bellamy's door. I stood there for a long time, waiting. I could hear sounds from inside, the scrape of something heavy moving across the floor, a muffled thump, but no footsteps approaching the door, no voice asking who was there, just those sounds, and then silence. I knocked again, waited again. Nothing. "Mrs. Bellamy?" I called. "It's your neighbor from 212. I just wanted to introduce myself." More silence. Then, from very close to the door, closer than I expected, closer than seemed possible, given that I hadn't heard footsteps, a voice. Quiet, flat, without any inflection at all. "Go away." That was it. 2 words. "Go away." And then more silence. stretching out until I finally backed away from the door and returned to my own apartment, my heart pounding for reasons I couldn't quite explain. I should have left it alone after that. Any reasonable person would have. She'd made it clear she didn't want contact, didn't want neighbors knocking on her door, didn't want anything to do with anyone. Fine. That was her right. I had no business inserting myself into her life. But I couldn't stop thinking about that voice, how close it had sounded, how she must have been standing right there, on the other side of the door, listening to me, waiting for me to leave. And those sounds I'd heard before she spoke, the scraping, the thump. What had she been doing? May arrived, finally bringing warmth. The smell faded almost entirely as the weather improved, which seemed to confirm my theory about the building's ventilation system. Jorge fixed the incinerator. Life settled into a routine. I got a promotion at work. Sarah and I became official. I started to forget about Mrs. Bellamy, about the smell, about all of it. And then the Hendersons moved into Unit 104. A young couple, maybe late 20s. Mark and Lisa Henderson, newlyweds from what I gathered, excited about their first apartment together. They were friendly and outgoing, the kind of neighbors who actually introduced themselves, who hosted a small housewarming party and invited everyone in the building. I went, more out of obligation than desire, and spent an hour making small talk with people I'd been living near for months, but had never really spoken to. I noticed that Mrs. Bellamy wasn't there. Her apartment was right next to the Hendersons' unit. 106 shared a wall with Unit 104, but she hadn't shown up for the party. When I mentioned this to Lisa, she laughed nervously. "We tried to invite her," she said. Mark knocked on her door twice. She never answered, but we could hear her moving around in there. "It's a little weird, right?" I nodded and changed the subject. But later that evening, as I was leaving, I looked up at Mrs. Bellamy's window. The curtain was pulled back slightly more than usual, and for just a moment, I thought I saw her standing there, watching the party, watching the Hendersons. Or maybe I was imagining it. Maybe I was projecting my own unease onto an innocent situation. Maybe Mrs. Bellamy was just a private person who didn't like parties, and I was turning her into something she wasn't. The Hendersons seemed happy in their new apartment. I'd see them walking through the courtyard, holding hands, laughing at private jokes. Young love, I thought. I remembered what that felt like. Before everything went wrong with my marriage, there had been a time when I'd been that happy, that carefree. It was nice to see, even if it made me a little wistful. But after a few weeks, I started noticing changes in them. Small things, at first. Mark looked tired all the time, with dark circles under his eyes that hadn't been there before. Lisa seemed jumpy, startled easily, kept looking over her shoulder when she walked through the courtyard. They stopped holding hands, stopped laughing. One evening in early June, I ran into Lisa in the laundry room. She was sitting on one of the folding tables, staring at the wall, her basket of clothes untouched beside her. She didn't seem to notice me come in. "Lisa?" I said. "You okay?" She jumped, badly, nearly falling off the table. When she looked at me, her eyes were wild for a moment before recognition kicked in. "Oh, sorry. You startled me. I noticed. Everything all right?" She didn't answer right away. She looked down at her hands, and I saw they were shaking slightly. "It's nothing. I just haven't been sleeping well." "The adjustment to a new place," I offered. "That's normal." "Yeah." But she didn't sound convinced. "It's just, do you ever hear things at night? From the building across the way?" My stomach tightened. "What kind of things?" "I don't know. Sounds, movement. Mark says I'm imagining it, but..." She trailed off, then seemed to catch herself. "Never mind. It's stupid. I'm just overtired." She gathered her laundry and left before I could ask anything more. But that night, I stayed up late, sitting by my window in the dark, watching Mrs. Bellamy's apartment, watching and waiting and not knowing exactly what I was looking for. At 2:17 a.m., her lights came on, all of them, just like before, blazing behind the covered windows, and I heard something faint, so faint I might have imagined it like a high-pitched whine, or a scream, or something between the two, something that didn't sound quite human but didn't sound quite animal either. It lasted maybe 3 seconds. Then it stopped. The lights went off, and the apartment was dark and silent again. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling and tried to convince myself that I hadn't heard what I thought I heard. A television, probably. Or someone's smoke alarm low on batteries. Or a fox in heat. They made sounds like that sometimes. I'd read. Sounds that could make your blood run cold if you didn't know what you were hearing. By morning, I'd almost convinced myself that's all it was. A fox, an animal noise, nothing more. Lisa Henderson was reported missing 2 weeks later. I remember exactly where I was when I found out. I was walking home from work, thinking about dinner plans with Sarah, when I saw the police cars in the parking lot. 2 of them, plus an unmarked sedan that I later learned belonged to a detective. Yellow tape around the entrance to the Hendersons' building. Neighbors gathered in clusters, whispering. I found Jorge in the courtyard and asked him what happened. "The wife," he said, keeping his voice low. "Lisa, didn't come home from work 2 nights ago. Husband reported it yesterday morning. Nobody's seen her since." 2 nights ago. I thought back. That would have been Wednesday. I tried to remember if I'd noticed anything unusual on Wednesday. I couldn't. Everything had seemed normal, but then, everything always seemed normal. That was the problem. "They think something happened to her?" I asked. Jorge shrugged. "I don't know what they think. They're talking to everyone, asking questions about anybody suspicious, anybody new in the area. You know how it is." I did know. I'd watched enough true crime to know that the spouse was always the first suspect, that most missing persons cases were domestic situations, that the simplest explanation was usually the right one. But I also knew about the smell that came and went, about the missing pets, about Mrs. Bellamy standing in the courtyard at midnight, watching the sky, about the sounds I'd heard through my window, and the sounds Lisa had heard too. The police came to my apartment that evening, 2 detectives, a man and a woman, asking routine questions. Had I seen Lisa recently? Had I noticed anything unusual? Did I know of any problems in the Hendersons' marriage? I answered honestly. I'd seen Lisa in the laundry room a few weeks ago. She'd seemed tired but fine. I didn't know of any problems. The Hendersons had seemed happy. And then, before I could stop myself, I asked, "Have you talked to Mrs. Bellamy in 106? She lives right next door to them." The female detective consulted her notes. We attempted to interview her. "She didn't answer the door. She never answers the door," I said. "That's what we gathered from other residents. We'll follow up." They left. And I stood in my apartment, looking out the window at Mrs. Bellamy's dark curtains, and wondered if I should have said more about the smell, about the sounds, about the creeping feeling I'd had for months that something was wrong in that apartment. But what would I have said? That my elderly neighbor was antisocial and strange? That I'd heard noises I couldn't explain? That animals had gone missing in the neighborhood, as if that were unusual? None of it was evidence of anything. None of it was proof. It was just a feeling, a suspicion, a collection of small details that added up to nothing concrete. Lisa Henderson was found 5 days later. Not her body. Her. Alive. Wandering along a highway 40 miles from town. Disoriented and dehydrated, but alive. She'd suffered some kind of mental breakdown, according to what I heard through the apartment complex grapevine. Walked away from her life without telling anyone. It happened sometimes, people said. The pressure of young marriage, a new apartment, stress at work. The mind could crack in ways no one expected. The Hendersons moved out within a month. Mark told Jorge they were going to stay with Lisa's parents while she recovered. They didn't have a forwarding address. They didn't say goodbye to anyone. I saw them loading their car on their last day. Lisa was wearing long sleeves despite the July heat, and she moved slowly, carefully, like someone very old or very ill. Mark's face was a mask, showing nothing. They didn't look at each other. They didn't look at anyone. They just loaded box after box into their car and drove away. I watched them go from my window, and I watched Mrs. Bellamy's apartment, where the curtain had moved just slightly, as if someone behind it was watching too. The summer passed. The smell returned, stronger than before. I started sleeping with my windows closed, despite the heat, just to avoid it. Sarah commented on it again, and this time, I didn't have a good explanation. The incinerator had been fixed months ago. There was no reason for a smell like that. "It's like something died in the walls," Sarah said. And I nodded without answering, because that's exactly what it smelled like. Something dead, something rotting, something that had been rotting for a very long time. I started researching. I don't know what I was looking for, exactly. Evidence that I wasn't crazy, maybe. Proof that my suspicions had some basis in reality. I searched online for news stories about the apartment complex, about Mrs. Bellamy, about missing persons in the area. I found nothing definitive, just the usual local crime reports. Nothing that suggested anything unusual. But I did find something interesting in the property records. Mrs. Bellamy's apartment, Unit 106, had been rented to the same tenant since 2005, 14 years. And before that, the unit had been vacant for nearly 2 years. The previous tenant, a man named Gerald Hoskins, had died there in 2003. I found his obituary with a little more digging. Gerald Hoskins, 78, passed away peacefully in his home, survived by a daughter, a son, 2 grandchildren, nothing suspicious. An old man dying in his apartment wasn't unusual. But there was something else in the records. A complaint filed in early 2004, 6 months after Hoskins died, from the neighboring unit. A complaint about a smell coming from 106. The complaint had been investigated and dismissed. The unit had been empty and clean, according to the maintenance report. The smell was attributed to a plumbing issue that was subsequently repaired. I sat at my computer for a long time after reading that, trying to decide what it meant. Probably nothing. Old buildings had old pipes. Smells came and went. People complained about their neighbors all the time. But the smell I was experiencing wasn't coming from bad plumbing. I knew that now. I'd known it for a while, I think, even if I hadn't admitted it to myself. The smell was coming from Mrs. Bellamy's apartment, and it wasn't constant because it was connected to something she did, something that happened every 5 or 6 days, with almost clock-like regularity. Something that involved those late-night trash runs, those deliveries from refrigerated trucks, those sounds that didn't sound quite human. I want to be clear about something here. I'm not a paranoid person. I'm not someone who sees conspiracies everywhere or believes in things that can't be explained rationally. I'm an accountant, for God's sake. I deal in numbers, in facts, in concrete realities. I'm the last person who should be telling a story like this, but I'm also someone who trusts his instincts, and every instinct I had was screaming at me that something was wrong with Mrs. Bellamy. Something beyond eccentricity or mental illness, or any of the reasonable explanations I'd been giving myself for months. I started watching her more carefully. Not stalking. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't following her around or peering through her windows with binoculars. I just paid attention. Noted when she left her apartment, which was rarely. Noted when deliveries arrived and how quickly they disappeared. Noted the pattern of the smell, which had become strong enough now that I could detect it even with my windows closed. The pattern was consistent. Every 5 to 6 days, the smell would peak, and every time it peaked, Mrs. Bellamy would make a late-night trip to the dumpster with one of those white trash bags, held away from her body like it contained something toxic. I started timing her. The trips always happened between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m. when the courtyard was deserted and no one else was around. She moved quickly for an old woman, her head down, her steps purposeful. She never looked around, never checked to see if anyone was watching. She just went straight to the dumpster, disposed of her bag, and returned to her apartment. The whole process took less than 5 minutes. After the 3rd time I watched this happen, I did something I'm not proud of. I went to the dumpster the next morning, before the trash collection came, and I looked inside. The bag was there, among all the other trash. White plastic, tied at the top, looking like every other garbage bag in the dumpster. But there was something different about it. A dark stain at the bottom, seeping through the plastic. And that smell concentrated, overwhelming, unmistakable now that I was standing right next to it. I should have opened it. I know that's what you're thinking. I should have untied the bag and looked inside and seen whatever was in there with my own eyes. That's what someone braver would have done. That's what someone who really wanted to know the truth would have done. But I couldn't bring myself to touch it. The smell was too strong, too wrong, too much like everything I'd been fearing and denying for months. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, staring at that bag, and then I walked away. Back to my apartment. Back to my normal life. Back to pretending I hadn't seen what I'd seen. The trash truck came an hour later. The bag was gone. And with it, whatever evidence might have told me what was really happening in apartment 106. September arrived. And with it, the new tenants in unit 104. I don't know why I expected the Hendersons' apartment to stay vacant. Buildings like Havenwood couldn't afford empty units. The turnover was quick, less than a month between the Hendersons leaving and the new people arriving. Their names were David and Michelle Park, a quiet couple in their 40s, no children, both working remotely from home. They seemed nice enough when I met them at the mailboxes one day, friendly but reserved, the way people are when they're still getting settled somewhere new. I wanted to warn them. I kept thinking about what Lisa Henderson had looked like when she left. Those long sleeves in the summer heat, that slow, careful way she moved, that hollow look in her eyes, like something had been carved out of her from the inside. I didn't know what had happened to her, not really. The official story was a mental breakdown, but I'd seen her face, and that wasn't the face of someone who'd simply snapped under stress. That was the face of someone who'd experienced something terrible. But how do you warn someone about something you can't name? What was I supposed to say? Watch out for the old lady next door, she's creepy? Don't pay attention to the smell that comes and goes. Even though it smells like death, I'd sound insane. More than that, I might actually be insane. I had no proof of anything. Just suspicions. Just feelings. Just that nagging certainty in the pit of my stomach that wouldn't go away no matter how hard I tried to logic it into submission. I said nothing to the Parks. I smiled when I saw them, made small talk about the weather, the neighborhood, the decent water pressure, and I watched Mrs. Bellamy's apartment, waiting to see if the pattern would repeat. It did. 3 weeks after the Parks moved in, I heard sounds from their apartment. Not the usual sounds of neighbors going about their lives, footsteps, muffled conversations, television noise. These were different, rhythmic, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. And underneath that, something else. Something that might have been crying, or might have been laughter, or might have been something in between. The sound stopped after about an hour. The next morning, Michelle Park looked like she hadn't slept. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed. When I saw her at the mailboxes again, she barely acknowledged me. "Everything okay?" I asked. She looked at me for a long moment, and I thought she was about to say something. Her mouth opened, her eyes searched my face, looking for something understanding, maybe, or reassurance. But then she closed her mouth, shook her head, and walked away. I almost followed her, almost pressed the issue, almost asked her directly if she'd heard anything from next door, if she'd noticed the smell, if she'd felt the same wrongness that I'd been feeling for almost a year now. But I didn't. I let her walk away. I told myself it wasn't my business, that I was projecting my own fears onto a situation I didn't understand. 2 nights later, I woke to the sound of screaming. It was 3:47 a.m. I checked the clock as I was getting out of bed. The scream came from somewhere outside, somewhere below me, and it cut off as suddenly as it had started. I went to my window and looked out. The courtyard was empty. Mrs. Bellamy's apartment was dark. Everything was silent. But I saw something moving near the dumpsters. A shape, barely visible in the dim light from the parking lot lamps. It was there for just a moment. Then it was gone. I couldn't tell if it was a person or an animal or my own imagination playing tricks. I didn't go back to sleep that night. I sat by my window until dawn, watching, waiting. Nothing else happened. The sun came up. The courtyard filled with the usual morning activity, people leaving for work, checking their mail, walking their dogs. Everything normal, everything exactly as it should be. Michelle Park didn't appear that morning. Neither did her husband. I told myself they were working from home. That's what they did. After all, remote work. They could stay inside for days if they wanted to. There was nothing unusual about not seeing them. But I watched their windows. I watched all day, from my own window, pretending to work on my laptop while keeping half my attention on the courtyard below. No movement behind their curtains, no lights turning on or off, no sign of life. And Mrs. Bellamy's apartment was quiet too. No deliveries, no late-night trash runs, nothing to mark it as different from any other unit in the building. The silence was almost worse than the sounds had been. On the third day, I knocked on the park's door. No answer. I knocked again, louder. Still nothing. I put my ear to the door and listened. I couldn't hear anything, no television, no voices, no movement. David? Michelle? I called. It's your neighbor from 212. Just checking if you're okay. Nothing. I stood there for a long time, trying to decide what to do. I could call the police, report a wellness check, but what would I tell them? My neighbors hadn't been seen in 3 days, and I had a bad feeling about the woman next door. They'd write me off as a paranoid busybody. They'd knock on the door, get no answer, and leave. Or worse, they'd knock on Mrs. Bellamy's door too, and she'd answer this time. She'd tell them everything was fine, that her neighbors kept to themselves, that she'd heard nothing, seen nothing, knew nothing, and they'd believe her because she was just an old woman, and old women weren't dangerous, were they? I went home. I sat at my desk, and I did something I should have done months ago. I called Sarah. She came over within an hour. I told her everything, the smell, the sounds, the missing pets, what happened to the Hendersons, my concerns about the parks. I probably sounded crazy. I felt crazy. But Sarah listened without interrupting. And when I was done, she didn't tell me I was imagining things. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "I don't know. That's the problem. I don't know what to do." "Have you talked to anyone else in the building? About the smell? About any of it?" I hadn't. I'd been so focused on not seeming paranoid that I hadn't asked whether anyone else had noticed the same things. But now that Sarah mentioned it, it seemed obvious. If I was right, I couldn't be the only one who'd noticed. Other people must have heard things, smelled things, seen things they couldn't explain. We spent the rest of that evening knocking on doors. The results were mixed. Some people looked at us like we were crazy. Some refused to open their doors at all. But a significant few, admitted that they'd noticed things too. Jorge, the maintenance man, said the smell had been an ongoing problem for years, and no matter what he did, he couldn't find the source. A woman in 108 said her cats had become agitated over the past few months, hissing and growling at the wall that adjoined Mrs. Bellamy's apartment. A man in 110 said he'd heard sounds late at night, sounds he couldn't identify, coming from somewhere nearby. Nobody had done anything about it. Nobody had reported it. Nobody had even talked to each other about it until Sarah and I started asking questions. We all just figured it was normal apartment noise, the woman in 108 said. "You know how it is. Old buildings make weird sounds." By the time we finished knocking on doors, it was nearly midnight. The courtyard was dark and empty. Mrs. Bellamy's windows were dark too, except for that familiar sliver of light through the gap in the curtains. "So what now?" Sarah asked. "I don't know," I admitted. "I still don't have any evidence, just a bunch of neighbors who've noticed the same things I have." "But you believe something's wrong." "Yeah, I do." Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "There's another way to find out." I knew what she was suggesting before she said it. I'd been avoiding the thought, pushing it away every time it surfaced, because I didn't want to face what it would mean. But Sarah said it anyway. We could look in her windows, late at night, when she's not expecting it. Just a quick look, see what we can see. It was illegal. It was dangerous. It was the kind of thing that could get us arrested, or worse. But it was also the only way to know for sure. We made plans. We'd wait until a night when the smell was at its peak, that would be 2 or 3 days from now, based on the pattern I'd observed. We'd go late, after midnight, when the courtyard was empty. We'd wear dark clothes. We'd be quick and quiet. We'd just look, just for a moment, and then we'd leave. If we saw something, anything, we'd call the police. And if we didn't, if Mrs. Bellamy's apartment was just a normal apartment with nothing suspicious inside, then I'd finally be able to let this go. Either way, I'd have my answer. The next 2 days were the longest of my life. I tried to act normal, went to work, made dinner, watched television without really seeing it. All the while, my mind was on what we were planning, what we might find, what we would do if our worst fears were confirmed. The smell peaked on Thursday night, strong enough that I could taste it in my mouth, even with my windows closed. I texted Sarah. Tonight. She arrived at 11:30, dressed in black, looking as nervous as I felt. We sat in my apartment until midnight, not talking much, just waiting. Then we went downstairs. The courtyard was empty. The parking lot lights cast long shadows across the pavement. Mrs. Bellamy's windows were dark. All of them. Even the usual sliver of light was gone. It was the first time I'd seen her apartment completely dark since I'd moved in. We crept around the side of her building, staying in the shadows. The ground floor units had small patios, fenced off with cheap wooden slats. Mrs. Bellamy's patio was overgrown with weeds, the fence leaning inward like it hadn't been maintained in years. And there was a smell that smells stronger here than anywhere else. So strong that Sarah stopped short and covered her nose with her hand. "Jesus," she whispered. "What is that?" I didn't answer. I moved toward the window, the one that looked into what should be the living room. The curtains were closed, but there was a tiny gap at the bottom where the fabric didn't quite reach the sill. I crouched down and looked through. I don't know what I expected to see. A normal living room, maybe. Ordinary furniture. The mundane reality of an eccentric old woman's life. That's not what I saw. The room was dark, but not completely. There was light coming from somewhere deeper in the apartment, a reddish glow that cast strange shadows on the walls. And those walls, they were covered in something. I couldn't tell what at first. Paper, maybe. Photographs. Something arranged in rows and columns, covering every visible surface. But it was the floor that made me stop breathing. There were shapes on the floor, dark shapes, piled in one corner. I couldn't see clearly. The angle was bad. The light was wrong, but they looked like bags. Black plastic bags, like garbage bags, stacked on top of each other. Except these were bigger than garbage bags, much bigger. And as I watched, one of them moved. Just a twitch. A small shifting, like something settling. But it moved. I saw it move. I pulled back from the window so fast that I fell. Sarah caught my arm, stopped me from hitting the ground. But she must have seen something in my face because she didn't ask questions. She just grabbed my hand and we ran. We didn't stop until we were back in my apartment with the door locked behind us. I was shaking, couldn't stop shaking. Sarah kept asking what I'd seen, what was wrong, what happened. I couldn't answer. I couldn't form words. Finally, after what felt like hours, I managed to speak. "Call the police," I said. "Call them now." The police came. Detectives came. They knocked on Mrs. Bellamy's door and got no answer. They got a warrant. I don't know how. I don't know what I said that convinced them, and they went inside. What they found, I only learned later. Through the news reports that followed, through the official statements that were carefully worded to reveal as little as possible, through the whispered rumors that spread through the apartment complex in the days and weeks after. They found the bags, 17 of them, stacked in what had once been the living room. Each one contained remains, animal remains, mostly, dogs, cats, small creatures that had been taken from the neighborhood over the years and brought here, to this place, for purposes that the investigators couldn't or wouldn't explain. But not all of them were animals. In the bedroom, they found something else. Something they never fully disclosed to the public, but that I pieced together from fragments of conversation, from the looks on the officers' faces, from the way Jorge crossed himself whenever anyone mentioned apartment 106. They found evidence that people had been there, not just Mrs. Bellamy, others. People who had come and gone over the years, some of them willingly, some of them not. The walls of the bedroom were covered with photographs, not the kind you'd find in a normal home, but something else. Something the investigators sealed in evidence bags and took away without comment. And they found a door. In the back of a closet, behind a false panel, there was a door that led down into a space that shouldn't have existed. A basement, of sorts, though the apartment complex wasn't supposed to have basements. A space that had been dug out over years, maybe decades, and used for things that I can't bring myself to describe. Mrs. Bellamy was arrested that night. I watched them take her out in handcuffs, her face as expressionless as it had always been, her eyes finding me in the crowd of neighbors who had gathered to watch. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The look she gave me said everything. I know what you did. I know you were watching. And you were right. The trial was brief. Mrs. Bellamy didn't contest the charges, didn't offer a defense, didn't explain anything. She sat in silence through the proceedings and accepted her sentence without reaction. Multiple life terms, no possibility of parole. She died in prison 3 months later. Natural causes, according to the official report. Heart failure. She was 73 years old. The apartment complex closed 6 months after that. Too many vacancies, too much bad publicity, too many people who couldn't bear to live in a place where such things had happened. The buildings sit empty now, windows boarded up, weeds growing through the cracks in the parking lot. Sometimes I drive past on my way to work, and I try not to look at it, try not to think about it, but I always fail. I think about the Hendersons sometimes, about Lisa, and what really happened during her breakdown, about whether she saw something, experienced something that the rest of us never knew about. I tried to find them once, to reach out, to ask. They'd moved to another state, changed their names, cut off all contact with anyone from their past. I don't blame them. I think about the Parks, too. They turned up 2 days after the police went into Mrs. Bellamy's apartment. They'd been visiting family out of state, they said. Their phones had died. They had no idea anything was wrong until they came home to find their building swarming with cops and crime scene tape. Maybe that's true. Maybe they really were just on vacation. But I remember the sounds I heard from their apartment that night. The rhythmic dragging, the crying that might have been laughter. And I wonder if they're telling the whole truth. I wonder if they ever will. Mostly, though, I think about all the things I didn't do. I should have reported the smell earlier. Should have pushed harder when the police brushed off my concerns. Should have talked to my neighbors, organized some kind of response, done something other than watching and worrying and telling myself it wasn't my business. Maybe if I'd acted sooner, some of those bags in Mrs. Bellamy's living room wouldn't have existed. Maybe someone would still be alive who isn't. Or maybe nothing would have changed. Maybe Mrs. Bellamy was too careful, too patient, too good at what she did. Maybe she would have continued for years, decades, the rest of her natural life, if I hadn't finally looked through that window, if Sarah hadn't been there to help me find the courage, if one of those bags hadn't moved. I still don't know what made it move. The police never explained. The reports never mentioned it. Maybe it was just settling, the way garbage settles. Maybe it was a trick of the light, my eyes deceiving me in the darkness. Or maybe something in that bag was still alive when I saw it, still conscious, still waiting to be found. I try not to think about that possibility. I try not to imagine what it would be like to be in one of those bags, in that room, in the darkness, knowing what was coming, hoping someone would notice, hoping someone would care. Sarah and I got married last year. We bought a house in the suburbs, far from any apartment complex, far from any neighbors who might have secrets. It's a nice house, safe, quiet, the kind of place where nothing bad could ever happen. But sometimes, late at night, I wake up to strange sounds, the house settling probably, the wind in the trees, normal sounds that every house makes. And sometimes, just for a moment, I could swear I smell something Swedish, something with rot underneath. I tell myself I'm imagining it, tell myself it's just a memory, a ghost of what happened, my brain unable to let go of the past. Tell myself that Mrs. Bellamy is dead, the apartment complex is closed, and whatever was happening there is over now. But then I remember all the months I spent telling myself the same thing, all the warnings I ignored, all the suspicions I dismissed, and I wonder if I'm making the same mistake again, if I'm missing something that's right in front of me, something that will only become clear when it's too late. I don't know. I'll never know. That's the thing about this kind of story. There's no clean ending, no moment of resolution where all the questions are answered and the world makes sense again. There's just what happened, and what didn't, and the long, uncertain space between. Mrs. Bellamy was real. What she did was real. The people and animals in those bags were real. Even if I'll never know all their names, never fully understand what drew her to them or how she got away with it for so long. And somewhere, right now, in an apartment complex, not unlike the one where I used to live, someone else is probably watching their neighbor, noticing strange smells, hearing sounds they can't explain, telling themselves it's nothing, telling themselves they're imagining things, telling themselves it's not their business. Maybe they're right. Maybe it really is nothing, or maybe it's not. I kept a box of the newspaper clippings for a while. Articles about the arrest, the trial, the discovery. I thought maybe someday I'd want to look at them again, remind myself that it really happened, but I threw them away eventually. I didn't need the reminder. The memories are enough. There's one thing I never told anyone, though. One detail I left out of my statement to the police, out of my testimony at the trial, out of every conversation I've ever had about that night. When I looked through Mrs. Bellamy's window, when I saw those bags on the floor, I saw something else too. Just for a moment, in the red glow from the back room, I saw a figure standing in the doorway. Not Mrs. Bellamy, someone else. Someone taller, thinner, with arms that seemed too long and a head that was tilted at an angle that didn't look quite right. The figure was watching me. I'm sure of it. Even through the window, even in the darkness, I could feel its eyes on me. And then it smiled, or at least, its mouth moved in a way that resembled a smile, and it stepped back into the shadows and was gone. The police never found anyone else in the apartment. According to their report, Mrs. Bellamy lived alone. According to every piece of evidence they collected, she acted alone. There was no accomplice, no partner, no one else involved in what she did. But I know what I saw. I saw someone else in that apartment. Someone who was there when the police arrived and somehow wasn't there when they searched the rooms. Someone who might have slipped out through that hidden door, down into that impossible basement, and out into the night. Someone who might still be out there. I tell myself it was a shadow, a trick of the light. My imagination filling in details that weren't really there. That's the only explanation that makes sense. That's the only explanation I can live with. But sometimes, when I'm driving past those boarded-up buildings, I think I see movement in the windows. Just a flicker, just a glimpse, gone before I can focus on it. And sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night, I hear sounds coming from somewhere I can't identify. Sounds that might be the house settling, or the wind, or something else entirely. And sometimes, just sometimes, I catch a whiff of that smell. You'll probably say I'm paranoid. That's what I'd say if someone told me this story. I'd nod and make sympathetic noises and privately think they'd lost their grip on reality. I'd tell myself that trauma does strange things to people, that the mind has a way of creating monsters where none exist. But here's the thing I keep coming back to. The thing that won't let me rest. I was right about Mrs. Bellamy. I spent months telling myself I was imagining things, that I was paranoid, that there was nothing wrong with my elderly neighbor except a little eccentricity. And I was wrong, dead wrong. 17 bags in a living room wrong. Unknown horrors in an impossible basement wrong. So when I smell that smell now, when I hear those sounds, when I catch that flicker of movement in my peripheral vision, I don't dismiss it as quickly as I used to. I don't tell myself I'm imagining things. I don't assume the simplest explanation is the right one. Instead, I pay attention. I watch, I wait, and I wonder how long it will be before I have to do something about it. Before I have to knock on another door, call the police again, look through another window and see something I can't unsee. Maybe it'll never happen. Maybe I really am just traumatized, jumping at shadows, seeing threats where none exist. Maybe the rest of my life will be perfectly normal, perfectly safe, and I'll never have to face anything like what happened at Havenwood again. But I don't believe that. The world is full of Mrs. Bellamys, full of people who hide in plain sight, who seem ordinary on the surface, who carry out unspeakable acts while their neighbors tell themselves it's nothing to worry about. They're everywhere, in apartment complexes, in quiet suburbs, in nice neighborhoods where nothing bad ever happens. You probably know one. You've probably seen them, talked to them, stood right next to them without knowing what they really were. You've probably noticed something off about them, a strange smell, an odd habit, a look in their eyes that made you uncomfortable for reasons you couldn't explain, and you probably told yourself it was nothing. I did too, once. I won't make that mistake again. If you've made it this far, if you've read this whole thing, then I have one piece of advice for you. Trust your instincts. Pay attention to the things that feel wrong, even when you can't explain why. Don't let the fear of seeming paranoid stop you from acting on what you know in your gut, because the worst thing that can happen if you're wrong is that you'll feel a little embarrassed, and the worst thing that can happen if you're right if you ignore what you're seeing, if you tell yourself it's nothing, if you look away until it's too late, is something none of us wants to think about. I still don't know everything that happened in apartment 106. I still don't know who or what I saw in that doorway. I still don't know how many victims there really were, or where they all came from, or why Mrs. Bellamy did what she did. But I know one thing for certain. I'll be watching from now on. Wherever I go, whatever I do, I'll be paying attention, noticing the things that don't add up, listening to that voice in the back of my head that tells me when something's wrong. And if I ever see those signs again, the smell, the sounds, the midnight trips to the dumpster, the curtains that never quite open, I won't wait. I won't talk myself out of it. I won't spend months wondering if I'm crazy. I'll act. Because somewhere out there, right now, someone is waiting to be found. Someone is hoping that their neighbors will notice, will care, will do something before it's too late. And I refuse to let them down. Not again. The other day, I ran into Jorge at the grocery store. He's working maintenance at a different complex now, on the other side of town. We stood in the produce section for 20 minutes, talking about nothing in particular, the weather, his new job, whether the avocados were ripe enough. Neither of us mentioned Havenwood. Neither of us mentioned Mrs. Bellamy. We didn't have to, but just before we parted ways, Jorge said something that stuck with me. He said he'd been having trouble sleeping lately. Bad dreams, the kind where you wake up drenched in sweat, heart pounding, unable to remember exactly what you saw but knowing it was terrible. You ever have dreams like that? He asked me. I told him yes. I told him I had them all the time. He nodded slowly, like that was exactly what he expected to hear. Then he put his hand on my shoulder and looked me right in the eyes. You did the right thing, he said. Back then, when you called the police, you did the right thing. I wanted to believe him. I still want to believe him. But late at night, when the house is quiet and Sarah is asleep and I'm lying awake staring at the ceiling, I'm not so sure. I did something, yes, but was it the right thing? Was it enough? Or was I just another neighbor, looking the other way until the problem became impossible to ignore? I don't know. Maybe I never will. What I do know is this. There are some questions that don't have answers. Some mysteries that don't get solved. Some stories that don't end with justice or closure or any kind of satisfaction. This is one of them. Mrs. Bellamy is dead. The apartment complex is abandoned. The bags have been disposed of. The evidence filed away. The case officially closed. But the smell still haunts me. The sounds still wake me up at night. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see that figure in the doorway, tall and thin, with its head tilted wrong, smiling a smile that isn't quite human, watching me, waiting. I moved on with my life, the way people do. I married Sarah. We had a daughter, beautiful and perfect in every way. I got a new job, made new friends, built a new routine that has nothing to do with apartment complexes or strange neighbors or the smell of something rotting behind closed doors. Most days, I don't think about any of it. Most days, I'm just a normal person, living a normal life, in a normal house, in a normal neighborhood. But then night falls. The shadows lengthen. The familiar creaks and groans of the house take on a different character in the darkness. And I remember Mrs. Bellamy standing in the courtyard at midnight, her face turned toward the sky. I remember the way her curtains never quite closed, always leaving that narrow gap, that sliver of light. I remember the sound of something heavy being dragged across a floor and the smell that followed. I remember looking through that window, seeing those bags, watching one of them move. And I remember the figure in the doorway, the one the police never found, the one that smiled at me and disappeared into the shadows. Sometimes I wonder if it ever really left. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, somewhere, doing whatever it did alongside Mrs. Bellamy, finding new partners, building new basements, filling new bags. Sometimes I wonder if it's watching me right now, the way I once watched it. I'll never know for sure. That's the nature of this kind of thing. The unanswered questions pile up until they're all you can think about. And then eventually, if you're lucky, life intrudes and forces you to move on, and the questions fade into the background noise of everyday existence. But they never quite go away. They never will. If there's anything I've learned from all of this, it's that the world is darker than we want to believe. Stranger, more dangerous. The monsters aren't always obvious. They don't announce themselves with fangs and claws and obvious evil. They look like old women in quiet apartments, like neighbors who keep to themselves, like people you'd pass on the street without a second glance. They hide in plain sight. They live among us, and most of the time, we never even know they're there until we do. I hope you never have to find out the way I did. I hope the strange smells you notice are just bad plumbing, and the sounds you hear are just the house settling, and the neighbor who gives you an uneasy feeling is just a little odd, nothing more. I hope, for your sake, that I'm wrong about everything. But if I'm not, if someday you notice something that doesn't quite add up, a pattern that doesn't make sense, a wrongness you can't explain, don't ignore it. Don't wait. Don't tell yourself it's nothing, because it might not be nothing. It might be everything. And by the time you know for sure, it might already be too late. There's a new family moving in across the street from us. I noticed them yesterday, a young couple with a toddler, unloading boxes from a moving truck, smiling and laughing as they carried their belongings into their new home. Normal people, happy people, the kind of people you want as neighbors. But this morning, I saw something that made me pause. The woman was standing at her kitchen window, just standing there, staring out at the street, not doing anything, just watching. And when she saw me looking at her, she didn't wave, didn't smile, just kept watching until I turned away. It's probably nothing. I'm sure it's nothing, but I'll be watching too, just in case. Sarah thinks I'm being paranoid again. She's probably right. After everything that happened, I see threats everywhere, monsters in every shadow. It's exhausting, this constant vigilance, this endless suspicion, but I'd rather be paranoid than oblivious. I'd rather be. So I watch, I wait, I pay attention to every detail, and I really hope that this time, it's nothing, but I'll keep watching closely, just in case.